Early January 1945. Dwight Eisenhower faced the worst command crisis of the war. His British field marshal had just insulted every American soldier at a press conference. His American generals were threatening mass resignation, and now Bernard Montgomery was demanding permanent command of 2 American armies. Eisenhower wasn't just looking at maps. He was carrying the weight of an alliance fraying at the seams. He sat between volcanic American fury and pompous British insistence. This wasn't just a command decision. This was a lonely battle to keep the Western world from eating itself before the war was won. Eisenhower couldn't fire Montgomery without destroying the alliance. He couldn't give Montgomery what he wanted without losing his American commanders. He needed a solution that would satisfy no one, but might keep everyone in the war. He offered Montgomery a compromise. Keep 1 American army for the Rhine crossing. That was all. No permanent command, no strategic authority. 1 army for 1 operation. Montgomery would have to choose. Accept this humiliating reduction or lose everything. Eisenhower waited for his answer. January 7th, 1945. Montgomery had stood before reporters and claimed he saved the Americans during the Battle of the Bulge. He described how he found American forces in disarray and organized the defense that stopped the Germans. He made it sound like American generals had panicked and British leadership had rescued them. The reaction was volcanic. American newspapers reported that Montgomery stole credit for American victories. Veterans organizations demanded explanations. Most dangerously, General Omar Bradley told Eisenhower he would resign rather than continue serving under a command structure that allowed such insults. When Montgomery claimed he handled the battle, it didn't just enrage generals. It cut deep for the GIs who had just survived the Ardennes meat grinder. To them, Montgomery's words felt like a second attack, this time from their own side, dismissing the sacrifices of the 19,000 Americans who never left those woods. Montgomery's own chief of staff, Major General Freddie de Gingand, flew to Eisenhower's headquarters and learned the truth. Eisenhower had drafted relief orders. Montgomery was hours away from being fired. De Gingand returned to Montgomery and forced him to write an apology. Montgomery apologized on January 8th. Not because he believed he was wrong, but because his own subordinate warned him his career was over. The apology prevented Montgomery from being fired. It did nothing to restore trust with American commanders. Now, 2 days later, Montgomery was about to make things worse. During the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower had temporarily placed 2 American armies under Montgomery's command. The U.S. First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, the U.S. Ninth Army, under General William Simpson, combined over 500,000 American soldiers. The arrangement was meant to be temporary. The German offensive had split the American front. Montgomery's headquarters was closer to the northern sector. He could coordinate the defense more effectively until the crisis passed. Montgomery saw opportunity where Eisenhower saw temporary necessity. He had proven during the Bulge that when Americans got into trouble, they needed British command to save them. His press conference had been clumsy, but the underlying message remained true. Now he wanted to make the temporary arrangement permanent. He wanted those armies for his great northern thrust into Germany. British and Canadian forces alone weren't enough. He needed American strength. Montgomery saw the Ninth Army as his security blanket, a force of 300,000 Americans he needed because his own British units were exhausted after 5 years of blood. For General Simpson and his men, it felt less like a partnership and more like being held hostage for a commander who didn't trust their methods. Within days of the press conference, Montgomery met with Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters. He presented his case formally. Keep First Army and Ninth Army under his command. Launch a concentrated offensive in the north. drive to the Ruhr industrial region, end the war by May. Montgomery argued military logic. The broad front strategy was wasting resources. American armies in the South were making limited progress. Everything should be concentrated for one massive thrust under unified command. He needed both armies for the plan to work. British forces were exhausted after 5 years of war. Canadian forces were under strength. American manpower was essential for breakthrough operations. Taking these armies away would doom the northern offensive. Eisenhower listened without interrupting. When Montgomery finished, Eisenhower's response was direct. The command arrangement had always been temporary. The armies would return to American command. Montgomery's face went cold. This would cripple his offensive. Eisenhower was making a military mistake for political reasons. Bradley had already made his position clear to Eisenhower. If Montgomery kept those armies permanently, Bradley would not accept it. He would not serve as an Army Group commander without armies to command. He would not watch Montgomery use American troops to pursue British strategic objectives while taking credit for American victories. Bradley's position was firm. He had commanded these armies since Normandy. They were his forces. Eisenhower's decision to place them temporarily under Montgomery during the Bulge had been operationally sensible. Making that arrangement permanent was politically impossible. Other American commanders supported Bradley. Eisenhower understood what Bradley was telling him. Keep Montgomery happy or keep American generals loyal. He could not do both. George Patton heard about Montgomery's demand and told Bradley he would resign alongside him. Patton's Third Army had saved Bastogne during the Bulge. His forces had stopped the German offensive from the south. American soldiers had done the fighting and dying. For Patton, this was the final straw. He had saved Bastogne. His warrior spirit had turned an entire army 90 degrees in a blizzard, and yet he was still being chained up by a man he viewed as an incompetent egomaniac. His threat to resign wasn't about rank. It was about his refusal to let American blood be spent on a political general's reputation. The threat of losing both Bradley and Patton would collapse the American command structure. Other generals would follow. The Army Group commanders who had fought across France would refuse to serve under British strategic direction. Eisenhower faced the nightmare Churchill had feared: a mass resignation of American generals, the alliance fracturing over command politics, the war in Europe jeopardized because Montgomery couldn't control his ego. Churchill called Eisenhower shortly after learning of the crisis. He understood the stakes. If Eisenhower stripped Montgomery of American armies completely, British influence over Allied strategy would end. The final victory would be entirely American. Churchill proposed a middle path. Let Montgomery keep the Ninth Army. Return First Army to Bradley. This would give Montgomery enough American strength for the Rhine crossing while returning most forces to American command. Eisenhower accepted Churchill's compromise. It was the solution he needed. Bradley would get First Army back. Montgomery would keep just enough American strength to maintain British strategic relevance. The transfer would happen immediately. But Churchill also knew he needed to repair the damage Montgomery had caused. On January 18th, he stood before the House of Commons to swallow a bitter pill. Forced to repair the damage of Montgomery's ego, he publicly admitted that the British Empire was now the junior partner, declaring that American troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. It was a humiliating moment of political submission that highlighted just how much the world had changed since 1939. Eisenhower knew he couldn't just issue a memo. He had to deliver the reduction in force to Montgomery's face. He called Montgomery in to explain the terms. Churchill's compromise had given the framework: one army for Montgomery, one army back to Bradley. But Eisenhower added the critical restriction that Churchill hadn't specified. First Army would return to Bradley's command immediately. Montgomery could keep the Ninth Army, but only temporarily for the Rhine crossing operation. After the Rhine was crossed, Ninth Army would also return to American command. This was not negotiable. Montgomery would command Ninth Army for Operation Plunder. That was all. No permanent command. No continued authority after the operation. One army for one specific mission. Montgomery asked when the army would return after the Rhine crossing. Eisenhower said that would be determined by operational circumstances, but it would return. Montgomery protested that planning long-term operations required knowing his force structure. Eisenhower repeated that the decision was final. Montgomery understood what was being offered. Accept this reduced compromise or lose both armies immediately. Keep one army temporarily or command only British and Canadian forces for the rest of the war. He accepted. On January 17, 1945, First Army officially returned to Bradley's 12th Army Group. General Hodges now reported to Bradley, not Montgomery. The command structure returned to what it had been before the bulge. Bradley was satisfied with this part of the compromise. He got his largest army back. Montgomery's authority over American forces was reduced to one army for one operation. The precedent that American armies would be commanded by Americans was reestablished. But Bradley was not satisfied with Montgomery keeping Ninth Army even temporarily. He believed Montgomery would use the Rhine crossing to argue for extended command. He believed Montgomery would find reasons to delay returning the army. He told Eisenhower to watch Montgomery carefully. Eisenhower told Bradley the decision was made. Montgomery needed Ninth Army for the Rhine crossing. After that operation, the army would return. Period. Montgomery spent February and March planning Operation Plunder. The assault across the Rhine would be the largest river crossing of the war. Massive artillery bombardment. 2 airborne divisions dropped behind German lines. Ninth Army would be the southern prong of the attack. Simpson's Ninth Army worked closely with Montgomery's staff. Simpson respected Montgomery's organizational skills and thoroughness. The planning was meticulous. Every detail anticipated. Montgomery's strength was preparing set-piece operations where nothing was left to chance. But Ninth Army officers noticed something troubling. Montgomery's staff talked about operations beyond the Rhine as if Ninth Army would remain under British command. Plans for advancing into northern Germany included Ninth Army forces. No one mentioned the Army returning to American command after the crossing. The plans didn't just ignore Bradley. They treated the Ninth Army as a permanent fixture of the British 21st Army Group. Eisenhower said he would handle it after the Rhine was crossed. On March 22, 1945, Patton's Third Army reached the Rhine near Oppenheim. Within hours, elements of Third Army were across the river. Patton called Bradley immediately. His instructions were specific. Tell the world we're across. I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts his engines. Patton's crossing was opportunistic. He saw a weakly defended section of river and attacked immediately. No massive preparation. No elaborate planning. Just rapid exploitation of German weakness. This was more than a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of American mobile warfare doctrine in its purest form. Montgomery heard about Patton's crossing and was furious. This was typical American recklessness. The Rhine required proper preparation. Patton had gotten lucky. The real crossing would be Operation Plunder, where professional planning ensured success. But Patton had proven something important. The Rhine could be crossed without Montgomery's elaborate preparations. American methods worked. The warrior had beaten the politician by one day. Operation Plunder launched on March 23, 1945. Over 300,000 Allied troops participated. Ninth Army attacked from the southern sector. British and Canadian forces attacked from the north. Massive artillery support. Airborne divisions seized key positions. Engineers constructed bridges under fire. The operation succeeded. Montgomery's forces crossed the Rhine and established a substantial bridgehead. German resistance was heavy, but Allied strength was overwhelming. By March 25th, forces were advancing beyond the river into Germany. Montgomery declared the operation a complete success. Perfect execution. The northern route into Germany was open. British and Commonwealth forces had led a massive river assault that demonstrated careful planning could overcome any obstacle. American newspapers noted that Patton had crossed first with fewer casualties and less preparation. Operation Plunder was impressive, but it followed Patton's proof that the Rhine could be taken rapidly. Simpson's Ninth Army performed excellently during the operation. American troops had done much of the fighting. Montgomery praised their performance. He told his staff the Army was essential for operations beyond the Rhine. After the Rhine crossing, Montgomery's staff submitted operational plans for advancing into northern Germany. The plans included Ninth Army forces. Montgomery argued that removing Ninth Army now would disrupt operations that were already underway. He told Eisenhower that the Ruhr encirclement required continued unity of command. Ninth Army was positioned to complete the encirclement from the south. Transferring the Army to American command in the middle of the operation would be militarily foolish. The irony was a jagged pill for the Americans to swallow. Patton had been starved of fuel in September to prop up Montgomery's 90% successful failure at Market Garden. Now, Montgomery was asking to steal those resources again, proving that for some, the alliance was only a tool for personal glory. Eisenhower saw exactly what Patton had predicted. Montgomery was using operational necessity to extend his command of Ninth Army indefinitely. Every operation led to another that supposedly required keeping the Army under British command. Bradley told Eisenhower the time had come. Montgomery had his Rhine crossing. The operation was successful. Now return the Army as promised. Eisenhower agreed. On April 4th, 1945, Ninth Army officially returned to Bradley's 12th Army Group. The transfer was final. Montgomery commanded only British and Canadian forces for the rest of the war. Montgomery protested to Churchill. This would cripple his advance into northern Germany. Ninth Army had been essential to every operation since the Rhine crossing. Taking it away now made no military sense. Churchill did not intervene. The political cost of fighting this battle was too high. Britain's influence over Allied strategy had been declining since D-Day. This was the final admission that American forces would be commanded by Americans. Simpson's Ninth Army continued advancing into Germany under Bradley's direction. They linked up with Soviet forces at the Elbe River later in April. The army that Montgomery had desperately wanted to keep played its role in the final victory under American command. Montgomery's 21st Army Group advanced into northern Germany and the Netherlands with only British and Canadian forces. They liberated the Dutch population. They captured German ports. They accepted surrender of German forces in their sector on May 4th. But Montgomery was commanding only Commonwealth forces. His vision of leading a massive Allied thrust to Berlin had died in January when Eisenhower took First Army away. The Rhine crossing with Ninth Army had been his final operation commanding American troops. Eisenhower's compromise wasn't just a political bridge. It was a strategic gauntlet that Montgomery was bound to struggle with. By letting Montgomery keep one army temporarily, Eisenhower proved that even with American strength, Montgomery's methodical approach was slower than American mobile warfare. Patton crossed the Rhine first. American armies advanced faster into Germany. Montgomery, with Ninth Army, still couldn't match Patton's speed. The gamble of giving Montgomery one last chance with Ninth Army was risky. 4 months earlier, Montgomery's Operation Market Garden had failed disastrously despite intelligence warnings he ignored. Montgomery had called that failure 90% successful and faced no consequences. Eisenhower was betting Montgomery had learned from that disaster. He hadn't. When Montgomery tried to keep Ninth Army permanently after the Rhine crossing, Eisenhower had justification to take it away. Montgomery had been given his chance. He had gotten his elaborate operation. Now American armies would finish the war under American command using American operational methods. The lesson? Coalition warfare requires trust, and Montgomery destroyed that trust with his press conference. Eisenhower gave him one last chance with Ninth Army. Montgomery tried to exploit it. He lost everything. In the end, Montgomery's vision of a great northern thrust to Berlin didn't die in a German ambush. It died in a press room. By choosing his ego over the alliance, he lost the trust of the men he needed most. Eisenhower gave him enough rope to hang himself, and Montgomery used every inch of it.